The key to solving back pain is restoring normal muscle function. We have 5 steps. We've talked about the 5 steps. Today is about hip dominance, or one hip being dominant, or a hip bias, kind of like we talked about back pain bias with motion patterns. This is about hip motion patterns. And very often what happens is one hip becomes dominant and it leads to a lot of problems, very much back pain, but also sometimes scoliosis. And we'll talk a little bit about that because this came up in a conversation not too long ago. But I'm going to do this. This is going to be a 4-part series about the 4 causes of muscle amnesia, or decreased neural drive, which is the amount of information that the nerves are sending to the muscles, or the intensity of the information that the nerve is sending to the muscles, because it becomes short-circuited, or neurologically it starts to slow down and turn off, which is what causes the weak muscle, which perpetuates the back problem. So this is going to be all about really the educational series, because when you understand what is causing your back pain and how to treat it, it gives you power. It empowers you to solve the problem. But what happens is there's a lot of bad information on the internet and coming from doctors and physical therapists and surgeons that is causing you to believe that you cannot get better. We call those false beliefs. But it's this information that's no good, bogus, that leads to your belief that you're not going to get better, or it should be going faster. So when you have these beliefs that you can't get better, the muscles get weaker. You don't solve the capacity problem. So the solution really becomes solving the muscle weakness. That's why you need to know what causes it. And it's not one cause. There's 4 that we're going to talk about, but there's more than that. But there's 4 main ones that we do every single day that perpetuates this problem. So number 1, you need to know the first principle of why you have back pain is the uneven load or stresses and repetitive stresses on the disc. The disc is designed to be balanced. You want steady, balanced sort of pressure. You don't want uneven pressure for too long. It can handle uneven pressure, but not all day, every day. It's really designed to be in a very specific position where the stresses are balanced throughout the disc. But what happens is sometimes that load changes, and certainly when you sit. And when you bend a lot, it forces the nucleus to jelly out, and then what happens is it starts to aggravate the annulus, and then the annulus starts to tear. And as you get that tear, what happens is the nucleus starts to follow the tear out. It can bulge, it can herniate, it can tear all the way through, and that's the process that starts the degeneration, which creates the instability, which is another problem that causes the amnesia, but that's not today. Today is about old injuries. So ankle injuries, knee injuries, hip injuries, and they could have happened a long time ago. Could have happened, that was my dog, could have happened 10 years ago where you injured your ankle and the ankle injury went away. But what happens is the nervous system starts to change and you develop what's called guarding. It guards the tissues. But what they found is when you have an ankle injury or a knee injury or hip injury, you can start to develop glute amnesia. Amnesia in the glutes. And sometimes it happens on just one side. That's when it becomes a problem. So you get the ankle injury and the nervous system starts to change. And the change in the nervous system starts to cause one hip to get amnesia. So it's the glute amnesia. So you develop one hip that maintains its strength, and the other hip gets amnesia. And when I say hip, I'm talking about the glute, or glute medius. Glute max and glute medius. But when you develop the amnesia, you don't even know it's happening because the ankle pain went away. Now this muscle problem is being perpetuated because it's ingrained in the nervous system. Okay? It's a software problem. It's not a hardware problem. It's in the software. Software we can fix. You develop a dominant hip. One hip does the work. It's like a bias, kind of like the bias of the spine. So you start to develop poor movement patterns. Why? Because one hip's not doing what the other hip is doing. One gets tighter than the other. One gets weaker than the other. That perpetuates the instability. You develop the glute amnesia from the guarding. You get poor motion. The joint doesn't work. And then the pelvis starts to shift because the pelvis can shift. It's 3 different bones, and then you get muscle compensation. And then the whole cycle continues. And all the while, it starts to aggravate the disc. We've talked about the 5 phases. The 5 phases are really designed to solve that. But what we're trying to solve is this cycle that's taking place as a result of the guarding of the tissues. People say all the time, I had hip surgery, my back now hurts. I had ankle problems. I sprained my ankle. Now I'm having a back problem. Sprained an ankle. Now I have a herniated disc. How did that happen? Well, it happened because one hip became dominant and the other hip developed a glute amnesia. Okay, we've talked about the 5 steps, but what happens? We've talked about the bias of the spine, but you develop a bias in the hip. Okay, the same way you have a problem with flexion and extension, certain patterns make you better, certain patterns make you worse. Same thing with the hip. You develop the dominant hip, certain patterns start to develop. Okay, one side you'll get glute weakness, and then the opposite side you'll get quadratus lumborum weakness. So the same way you get lower cross syndrome, you get hip cross syndrome. You get one hip dominant, so the dominant hip is going to lead to the opposite side strength in the quadratus lumborum. Weak glute medius is going to lead to a weak quadratus lumborum on the opposite side. It'll develop a cross, okay, like an X. And when that happens, you start to develop some shifting in the pelvis. The pelvis is 3 bones. Okay, you've got the ilium, you've got the sacrum, and then in the front you've got the pubis bone. So you've got the sacroiliac bone in the back. And I get this question too, oh, the doctor said my sacroiliac joint is bad. You don't have a bad joint, you've got a weak muscle. You've got a dominant hip. This is a question I get a lot. Oh, it's my sacroiliac joint. Yes, I know, I had it. Okay, dominant hip causes the muscle weakness, which then creates call it a floppy sacroiliac joint. It's not holding the way it should because the muscle's not doing what it should. But what happens when you have 3 joints is you can get rotation of the pelvis. So the hips can shift a little bit because there's 3 joints. One joint here, the pubis, and then you've got the sacroiliac joint, 2 of those, bilateral, right? And then around that pivot point, it can shift. And when you get slight shifting, what it does is it throws the hips a little bit out of balance, which then causes a slight curvature of the spine. People say, oh, I have scoliosis. Can you help my scoliosis? What we do is we work with the muscles to restore the function to the hips, which then starts to straighten out the curve. Okay, it doesn't have to be 100% straight. It just has to be a little bit better to unload the disc and restore normal function to the hips. We see this all the time. Restore function to the hips. Now, it doesn't have to be this is a pretty advanced scoliosis. It can be a simple scoliosis. What's causing the scoliosis? Well, the simple one, very often it's the rotation of the pelvis, and then the spine follows. One hip strong, quadratus lumborum strong, pulls in that direction. The weak one allows things to sort of curve away because the muscles are weak, not holding. You get this cross syndrome. And what you do ultimately is you start to balance that out. But when the disc, when the curvature is bad, it overloads the disc starts to push out, and you develop that little tear, you develop the bulge, you develop the herniation, you develop all these different things, and that by its very nature creates an instability. So what do? What do you do to fix it? You have to have healthy movement patterns. We have to start with the healthy movement patterns. We have to create the stability, okay, and then we have to create the endurance in the spine, and then we restore the motion to the hips. Fix the bias of the hips, fix the bias of the spine, fix the bias of the hips, and create functional strength. Get the whole process going in the right direction. Healthy movements, create the stability, the endurance, all the things necessary. It continues. It doesn't go around once. You got to keep making it better, keep making it stronger. You don't stop, okay? Keep it moving. And what we have found is the herniations can go away. You can make it stronger. So what is the goal? The goal is to move in ways that don't aggravate the discs. You don't want to aggravate the disc. And we have to activate the core, front, back, side to side. Start to stabilize quadratus lumborum, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus. Create the endurance. Create the hip mobility. 360 degrees of strength of the hip. Okay, we do squats and we do lunges in 360 degrees to restore that normal motion. The goal is resilience. You have to be stronger. You have to increase your capacity. That's what it is. That's the goal. You want to get better? This is what you have to do. This is why very often you'll develop a curvature of the spine. This question came up the other day. What about scoliosis? Dominant hip. You fix the dominant hip, you start to fix the pain because things start to get better. This is a statement I make all the time. Pain relief is weakness leaving the body. Create the strength. There's 5 steps to create the strength. It's about spinal bias and hip bias. You develop a weak pattern of the spine, flexion extension, we fix that. You develop weak patterns in the hips, we fix that. Restore normal muscle function. Doesn't happen in a day. You can't fix this in a day. You can fix it in 3 months, 6 months, a year. Doesn't matter how long you've had the back pain. It can go away. Do the work. Learn the information. Okay, when you don't know, that leads to a weakness. You need to solve that by education of the spine. We're going to do 4 of these videos. This is number 1. We solve all this with the 10X. Go get it. If you're not involved with the 10X, I want you to get involved with the 10X. It's a program specifically designed to solve these problems. Walks you through step by step to fix this. It's the only way out. It's the only way out. You go to totalbackpainrelief.com/10X order. That's how you get in the program. We're going to make it better. Go get them. That's it. Sign up. Click a link. You're in.